words all share is that they are generally accepted to connote evil. So what the placard strategy does is it inserts a refrain, like a nursery rhyme, into people's minds. Israel, Zionism, starve David equal evil. Israel, Zionism, starve David equal evil. Now, I have talks from years ago in which I say genocide. That was before October 7th. How did I know? Because they were always trying to pin that word. I remember many years ago when no one was dying, it was a period of really there was calm and quiet, and I was in a panel with a Palestinian speaker who spoke about the cultural genocide that Israel is committing. I was thinking, what is that? But it didn't matter. Because no one was dying, they just used the word genocide with cultural, but the key was to use genocide next to Israel. So someone recently asked me, they said, okay, if you've been following those words, what's the next word bubbling up? And I said, actually, we've reached the final station. Because genocide was always going to be the ultimate word, because it's considered the ultimate evil, and there was a particular desire to show the Jews as having committing genocide, because then it retroactively kind of justifies what was done to us. But the reason I know that we've reached the final station is after October 7th, there's a new placard that I didn't see before. And it says, keep the world clean. And it has the Star of David and the trash bin. You can look it up, just do keep the world clean, Zionism, and you'll find it. And it began to appear in a lot of the anti-Israel demonstrations. And I said, this is the final station. After years of building up the Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil, we've actually reached the most ancient and most dangerous idea. And the idea says this: there's a clean world to be had. It's a world of utopia. It's not a coincidence that all the evil words are on the side of Israel, colonialism, racism, genocide, and all the good words are on the side of the anti-Israel, of Palestinianism, rights, justice, equality, liberation, freedom. So there's a world of cleanliness, of justice, of equality, and the only thing that stands between this dirty world and the clean world of utopia is the collective Jew. And that's the most ancient and most dangerous idea out there. So that is where I see ourselves globally. Within our region, what is coming together under this kind of global thing is, I'm no expert on Iran, never have been, but I am an expert on who have supported the Palestinians for the last century. So I think we can safely say, even if it's not a convenient thing to say, that no one would have cared about several hundreds of thousands of Arabs living on the shores of the Mediterranean if they had not committed themselves to wage a total war against very specific kind of Jews, the Jews who dared imagine themselves sovereign, upright, masters of their fate. The fact that the Arabs of that area committed to wage a total war, initially to prevent the Jews from being sovereign, and then to try to undo Jewish sovereignty, made them incredibly valuable for every anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist power in the last century. So in the 30s and 40s, they had a fruitful collaboration with the Nazis. And in the 40s and 50s and 60s, the Pan-Arabists turned the Palestinianism into secular theology of the Arab identity. And in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the Soviet Union took Palestinianism global with Zionism as racism, inserting it into international bodies, the academia, where it flourishes now. And now it's Iran. So there's good news here. The good news is, with a fairly high level of certainty, I can say that the Mullah and Ayatollah regime will find itself with the same fate in the same dustbin of history as the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, and the Soviets. The bad news is on the way to the dustbin of history. They cause a lot of damage to the Jews and some global mayhem. So as I look at this moment, I wonder, are we at the beginning of this? Are we past the peak? I fear we're more at the beginning of the damage to the Jews and the global mayhem. And the Jews have a timing problem, because by the time the world wakes up, a lot of damage is often done to us. So this is how I think of this moment, and we can later talk more about the Palestinian conflict itself. But ultimately, we're at this moment where the global ideology of keep the world clean with the Palestinianism as the ideology of opposing Jewish statehood, supported by the most anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist power of the moment of Iran, is all coming together.
It's so interesting well, first of all, that's terrifying. And I do appreciate that little bit of hope. Eventual hope. But it was interesting to me what you just said, which was you sort of clustered, Iran and its proxies and Russia and China and others together. And I would say the only category of sort of people that my daughter would say, like the haters, right? The only category that you missed out is somehow like American college kids. So I'm actually wondering, I know you just said that you spoke to college students recently. Yes. You've worked at Georgetown University. You deal with college visitors in Israel, frequently. What's your take on what's happening on college campuses, and how is it that American college students at good universities and at universities across the board are saying, like, we are Hamas?
So first of all, the college students and the faculty are some of the most important carriers of the placard strategy. The placard strategy and anti-Zionism as a respectable replacement for anti-Semitism was really hatched in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the Russians, the Soviets, they don't get enough credit for their contribution to their global Jew hate, which, they should. They literally wrote the book, right? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a Tsarist Russian forgery that set the stage. Now, today, anyone can publish a book, but imagine 120 years ago. If something was in a book, it was respectable. So all these conspiracies about Jews now had the respectability of a book. There was no longer a church. So now you had the respectability of print. And the book mattered. And the Nazis didn't invent much. Much of what they said about the Jews, much of it came from the protocols. Now, when the Bolsheviks bring down Tsarist Russia, they claim to be against anti-Semitism. Lenin speaks against anti-Semitism because that was of the Tsar, and the Tsar is evil. And ultimately, after World War II, when they defeated the Nazis, right, you don't get to be more anti-Semitic than having defeated the Nazis, they develop anti-Zionism as this respectable replacement, using Zion. And what they do is that this time it's not one book, it's an entire academic discipline. You get PhDs in anti-Zionism. You get PhDs in Zionism as colonialism. The Palestinian leaders are all educated in the Soviet Union. They get their PhDs. Abu Mazen got his PhD in essentially Holocaust denialism and inversion, which is part of anti-Zionism. And they export it initially to the European left through Marxist circles, and from there it makes it to the American left and to academia. And the key issue here is respectability, because you get a PhD that says that Zionism is colonialism. Your professor is tenured because they said Zionism is colonialism, and then they teach that. And then the other things that the Soviets also did was to create the respectability through international bodies. So Zionism is racism, goes through the United Nations, and that is a placard strategy in the UN. This is one of the shortest UN resolutions, and we hereby resolve that Zionism is a form of racism. So, well, if the UN said then Zionism is racism, then it is. Bringing the case of genocide to the International Court of Justice. The head of the court said, we didn't say that Israel's committing genocide, but who cares anymore? Because what mattered is to put Israel, genocide, and International Court of Justice in the same phrase, and that's it. It doesn't really matter what the court will say anymore, and it gives a respectability. So now college students can be in their encampments and say Israel's committing genocide, and as far as they're concerned, this is true, because everybody said so. I wrote this piece a while ago called The Palestine Propaganda Complex, in which I talk about the placard strategy, and I start by discussing an essay by Echad Ha'am. And the essay by Echad Ha'am is from about 140 years ago, and it's called Chatzi Nechama, half solace. And where does he find half solace? In the blood libel, the original blood libel. Because why? He was writing at the end of the 19th century. Jews were leaving the ghetto. They were becoming part of mainstream society. This is the height of emancipation. And Echad Ha'am is concerned that with the ghetto walls now down, the Jews will begin to assimilate what is being said about them. And they will be surrounded by what he calls a general agreement about their evil nature. And he feared that they will begin to think that this is what being Jewish is, what all the other people say it is. So he found half solace in the blood libel, because he says Jews know that the blood libel is wrong. The Jews do not eat blood or drink blood. They know it's wrong. So he says by knowing that it is possible for the whole world to be wrong and for the Jews to be right, they will steel themselves and be able to understand that it's actually possible. Because the way that the general agreement works is by instilling doubt, right? We talked a bit before about, are we crazy? So if everyone keeps telling you genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, you're like, maybe we're that evil thing they say about us. Hey, maybe the world would be better off. And I, as a Jewish student who wants to do good, I want to do good. And there's no greater good in this world than eradicating evil. So let's keep the world clean. I'm going to be at the forefront of these demonstrations to do good. And this mechanism of general agreement that operates through international institutions, academia, and academia matters because it's the new church, right? Nobody listens to the Pope anymore, but what Harvard says, that's valuable, right? So actually the academia matters because it's the new purveyor of what's the right thinking, what's the doctrine, right? This is the doctrine. Someone, I think Marty Friedman recently said that Americans, especially secular ones, are so removed from religion that they don't notice religion when they see it. So they don't understand that this whole, everything they're doing is religion with the high priests of the academia and the doctrine and the right thinking and the good and evil, and of course, like with every religion, the Jews.
So, pause with me for 1 second.
Yes.
All right, so Moment Magazine, I was looking at a recent magazine, and it said this, and I thought it was actually interesting. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, modern Orthodox thinker, he said, and I'm going to quote him, I believe that people that use their Jewish status to give respectability and heft to the denial of Israel's right to exist, such as some members of Jewish Voices for Peace, listen carefully, should be rejected by the community and treated as Jewish enemies of the Jewish people. And I keep coming back to that, So I actually was wondering, what do you think about that? And, you know, the way that you're talking about what's happening on college campuses, you know, for sure, it's a complicated and complex situation for the Jewish students, perhaps. But what do we do, like, for those people who have children that are heading to schools that are most likely going to be returning to encampments, if we are, as you're saying, sort of at the beginning and not in the middle or the end, it's going to get worse on college campuses, most likely, and I'm imagining that it might even move down to the high schools and the middle schools and the lower schools in our neighborhoods. Like, what do you think, and I know you're coming from Israel, so, and Israel is, you know, right now isn't a good time to ask a question about America, but I'll ask it anyway. Like, when you watch what's happening, if you could stand on a soapbox and speak to the college students, the faculty, the parents that are paying the bills, what would you say?
So step one is, for me, is to actually understand what's going on. One of the things that we've wasted a lot of time on is to think that the placard strategy was a good faith conversation about Israel. And as a result, we spent so much time saying, oh, it's not apartheid. Look, we have Arab judges, and Arabs are full citizens, because we thought this was really a discussion about Israel. I made that mistake. I spent too much time on that, too. I remember the moment when I realized it, and I started telling people, it's not about Israel. And they were like, what do you mean? They just said that Israel's apartheid or that Israel's committing genocide. It is about Israel. I was like, no. This is not a discussion about Israel. It's not a political discussion. It's the creation of a mental environment by which the collective Jew, now going at it through Israel, through Zionism, but if there weren't Israel or Zionism, it would be something else, in order to say the world would be better without you. Now, about the Jews who participate in it, I have to say that a part of me actually has quite a bit of empathy, because what we are all subject to, including students on college campuses, is a relentless dynamic of bullying. When I taught at Georgetown as a visiting professor, I taught a course on Zionism and anti-Zionism, which is now available also online if you want to view it. The student who produced the online course, she came up to me at the end of the real course in Georgetown, and she told me, this course was more valuable to me than dozens of hours of therapy. And through the discussions with her, I began to crystallize this notion that anti-Zionism on campus takes an emotional toll on the students. And it takes an emotional toll because it operates like bullying. And the dynamic of bullying looks like this. You mentioned Jewish Voices for Peace. You know, when a bully asks for your lunch money, you give the lunch money, they don't go away, right? They come back the next day and they ask for more. So when I was in college in the 90s, I was pro-Israel and supporting two states, and that was a very normal position to have. And then you had J Street, and then J Street U, and then If Not Now, and then Jewish Voices for Peace. And now, if you're not the Jewish militant co-chair of Students for Justice in Palestine, you're not a good enough Jew. And this process of the relentless bullying, I called it the pound of flesh dynamic, because in opposition to Shakespeare, it's actually the Jews who typically are demanded to hand over the pound of flesh, sometimes real, hopefully mostly metaphorical, essentially to mutilate their Jewish identity as the price of belonging. And it's a relentless and powerful dynamic, and some people succumb. That's why, in some ways, I can't call them enemies, because the pressure gets to people. Just like Ahad Ha'am recognized a general agreement, some people succumb. And a lot of the young students I work with, almost all of them had a moment, I call it the T intersection, where they were demanded to give another pound of flesh. You know, it used to be enough to say, I hate Bibi. That got you through the door. Now, it's an exorcism ceremony. You have to say that Israel is evil and genocide. So a lot of the young students I work with, they all had this moment where they suddenly, they realized, they were like, this is never going to end, right? You're always going to ask for more. It's only going to end when there's no more pounds of flesh to hand over because I no longer exist or I'm no longer recognizably Jewish. So, and they took a step back, and many of them also, as a result, reclaimed Zionism, became Zionists because Zionism became a way as a shorthand to say, I'm a confident Jew. Go away, right? Because bullying preys on shame. You told me how your community, they're confident, you're confident. When you're confident, bullies have nothing to work with. But when you feel ashamed of this Jewish association with Israel, they have something to work with. So when I met the students in this conference yesterday of Israel Coalition on campus, what I realized is they're going to campuses soon with the spirit of fighting. And what I actually felt is that they are going to have a much better and healthier time on campus knowing that they're going to fight. Because for many years now, too many people have been trying to run away from it. I've been speaking with rabbis over the years, Hillels. We don't want to talk about Israel. We don't want to talk about Zionism. And I'd be like, wrong, wrong. You can't run away from that. It will run after you if you try to run away from it. So stand your ground and talk about it. So I think the students who are going to campus thinking, okay, I'm just going to do this, I'm going to run away from this, they're going to have a terrible time because it will run after them. Anti-Zionism, you know, over the years I participated in these high-profile debates as to whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and I lost them all because, you know, they would bring the Satmar Jew, they would like bring a JVP, or fine. So after a couple of these debates where the energy was, when we lost, it was like pre-pogrom Eve energy. Like I felt like in those medieval debates where when the Jews lost, they were murdered, and if the Jews won, they were murdered. So that's what it felt like. And I went back and I thought, just a moment, that was not a normal debate. That was not, oh, are you for higher taxes, lower taxes? Very nice. You're the better debater. I was like, something else was going on there. And I went and I said, okay, this is not a theoretical question. This is a practical question. What happens to Jews when anti-Zionism becomes the dominant ideology of a country, a society, a campus? And here the historical record is definite. Wherever anti-Zionism rose to become structural, the environment turned hostile to Jewish life, as they were claiming that they have nothing against Jews, they love Jews, Jews are great, they had Jews at the forefront. It became hostile to Jewish life, and it was not stopped. No Jews were left. The Arab world, the Soviet Union, Poland in '68, Venezuela, Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party, American campuses. And when I started working with students and I told them, they said, how to talk to administrators. I told them, you know what, leave the whole theoretical debate as anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Just let them know that regardless of their personal views, this leads to no Jews on campus. Is that what they want? Now, some students came back and said this was very effective. And some students came back and said it's actually what they want. Because, you know, because the way that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism developed in many places, we look at the end point and we forgot how it began. Anti-Semitism in Germany begins in the universities. Herzl encounters it among the elite in the university. It's an elite ideology. It's not a deplorables ideology when it begins. It's the ideology of intellectuals. And it is used in order to clear Jews from coveted possessions in academia, in academia, professional positions. In Venezuela, in Poland in '68, it's used to remove Jews from positions, professional positions in academia. So I think we sometimes have to contend that, yes, some people don't know what they're doing, but actually some people know what they're doing. So I'll just say one thing about the students. My argument will be this. If you want to not have to engage with it, then fine. You know, I know some people are saying we need to leave for other campuses, campuses in the South, religious campuses, fine, that's one way. But if you're going to go to campuses that have this problem, then go with a fighting mindset. Because if you're not going to go fighting, if you're not going to stand their ground, if you think you can run away from it, you can't. They will run after you.
One of the things that you've been so clear about is strategy, right? And all of these trajectories, talking about the strategy. I'm actually just wondering if you could speak to the strategy of October 7th. And in particular, one of the things that was very interesting to me in a horrifying sort of way was that on October 7th, what we all saw was that the terrorists that came in, you know, of course, in waves into the Gaza envelope or to the kibbutzim or the Nova Festival, that initially they were proud and joyful and filming their, I'm looking around for 1 second, their rapes and their executions and their burning alive of human beings, like horrors upon horrors. And they just, you know, they sent them out into the world. They posted them. They sent to friends. You know, they did all of that. And then on October, maybe late in the day on the 7th or the 8th, they all disappeared, and suddenly October 7th really didn't happen. And I'm just wondering, in your eyes, was that a pre-planned strategy? And how did that actually play itself out, that people either didn't see or forgot or opted not to see, and the memories of October 7th seem to have been erased, even though we still have hostages?
So it's a few things. My brilliant colleague, Dr. Shani Moore, with whom I often like to write essays, wrote a remarkable essay after October 7th called Ecstasy and Amnesia. And it spoke to a Palestinian pattern in 47, 67, 2000, where they initiate wars, butchery, massacres, with glee, with ecstasy, with grand declarations of genocide, only that to flip when they begin to lose into complete amnesia of pure victimhood. And he looks at it as a recurring pattern. Now, this is what they did on October 7th is not new. When the War of Return was translated from Hebrew into English, by Elon Levy, by the way, when it was translated, Adi Schwartz and I realized that we can't just go with a translation. We had to change the book for an English-speaking audience. And one of the things we had to change is substantially add material to the first chapter on 1948. Because for Israel, we assumed general people understand what happened. But we realized that for an English-speaking audience, people think that 1948 looked like this. There was the peaceful peasant country of Palestine. And then came the evil Zionists, who already in 1948 had tanks and F-16s. And they proceeded to ethnically cleanse the peaceful land of Palestine, and that's how Israel came about. Now, some of you are laughing, but I don't think this is too cartoonish. I think a lot of people, this is pretty much what they think happened. So we realized that we actually need to convey what happened in the war, why refugees were created in that war, how brutal was that war, how total. So we included some pretty brutal scenes. I remember a colleague of mine from America, when I told him about that, he was like, "You're crazy." And recently I reminded him of that, and he's like, "Yeah." So one of the things we describe is how the Arab militias, after they burnt alive the Jewish convoys, going to the hospital, going to Jerusalem, mutilating their bodies, they took photos. The GoPro's cameras are not new. They took photos, and those photos of the mutilated Jewish bodies were sold in the markets of the old city. So the idea that they take pride in showing what they did. Elon Levy actually did a video yesterday that he said, we always said the massacre on October 7th was brutal, but he just watched again a 10-minute video that was given to the International Court of Justice. He said, brutal is not the word, he said it was sadistic. The glee. So over the years, when I talked, the book is called The War of Return. And people thought that it was a bit of a harsh name, the War of Return. When people think of the Palestinian right of return, when people think about return, they think of it as a nostalgic idea, right? A kind of, I miss a house of a great-grandmother long gone. But we would explain to people the idea of return in the Palestinian mindset was never innocent, was never idyllic, it was never a nostalgia. It always had the element of brutal triumph over the Jewish body. We have texts from the 50s, the 60s. They say we will rip their hearts out of their bodies. That was the vision of return. So after October 7th, I could tell people, look, October 7th is the Palestinian realization of the vision of return minute by minute. This is how they imagine it, and this is why you saw this euphoria, this support. The biggest lie that so many have tried to tell after October 7th is Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And the Palestinians go, yay, Hamas. And everyone's like, oh, no. Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. But Hamas not only is hugely popular, and they did October 7th because they knew it would be hugely popular. October 7th was the realization of the deepest Palestinian vision of what they hope to achieve. But, as Dr. Shani Moore said, once they do it, then they retreat into this pattern of complete reversal of cause and effect. And now what Israel is doing in Gaza is actually, if you listen to some Palestinian speakers, they describe it as the cause of October 7th. They're actually able, just like the wall that was built against the butchery of the Second Intifada, that's the reason they did the that's the reason they butchered us. Like, reversal of cause and effect is one of the most fundamental ways in which they tell the story. So there's never any consequences for their actions. And again, immediately amnesia sets in, and they're pure victims. Never any notion that they took action.
You started by talking about placards, right? Talking about that, and then you mentioned Elon Levy. So I want to take advantage of that opportunity, because something that you and he had spoken about was the idea of West-splaining, and you coined that term, I believe. And as we're talking about sort of strategy, it seems like West-splaining is a really important thing for people to be thinking about. And it's not only the term of genocide, which you spoke about before. it's all of these terms that are being used and confused and in many ways like usurped. And I'm just wondering, how should we respond to this misuse of language or new definitions, and do we just abandon using those words, or do we try to sort of reclaim them in some way?
So again, Dr. Shani Moore has another great piece called A Special Dictionary for Israel. And it is about how words were completely deformed in order to blame Israel. So apartheid was removed of any substantial meaning in order to say that Israel was committing it. Occupation was removed of any meaning in order to argue that Israel was still occupying Gaza after it left it. So they completely cleared occupation of its most fundamental meaning of effective control, which clearly we did not have, to claim that but it's only in the case of Israel. I think the key for us is to expose the mechanism. In this essay I wrote about the propaganda complex, I introduced this idea that I got on the internet that it's called the Brandolini principle, also known as the bullshit asymmetry principle. It's coined by an Italian programmer about a decade ago. He looked at the conversations on the internet and he said, the amount of effort required to refute bullshit is at least an order of magnitude greater than the effort to produce it. So they only need, and I remember when I read this principle, I was like, that's the Jewish condition. They say Israel's apartheid, that's 3 words, and we write books to explain. And, we train our students and why, and we show everything about Israel that's not apartheid. And it's almost a form of a Jewish tax, right? We need to spend so much of our time refuting those allegations. And like Sartre wrote, don't think that they don't know what they're doing. Part of what they want to do is for you to try to refute every allegation that they keep throwing. So I think for me a big part is expose the mechanism, expose how it works, how the words are being used not for their real content, but for their association with evil, and that they're only used in order to place Israel, Zionism, the Star of David as evil.
Will you speak a little bit about West-splaining?
Sure. So West-splaining, like mansplaining, is the notion that even though someone speaks clearly, it's when mansplaining came out, so many women went, yeah. I was in so many panels where you can see I'm a fairly coherent speaker. I would be in panels with people like, so what Einat was trying to say, like, what? So West-splaining is essentially this attitude that says, okay, the Palestinians are saying something, but we'll tell you what they really mean. So they will say from the river to the sea, and people will be like, no, they're just angry. It's a negotiating position. It's because of the blockade. It's like, so for me, my journey for the last 20, 25 years has really been about not only listening to the Palestinians, but listening carefully and giving them the respectability and giving them the respect of taking them at their word. But I can tell you that West-splaining is one of the most difficult things. One of the hardest elements that I find is almost a wall is when I tell people that Palestinians are adults. That is like unacceptable. The notion that they are agents of history, they know what they're saying, they know what they're fighting for, they have a vision. I was asked to present, there was this commission on UNRWA, and they had this former French, minister, and she came to listen. The idea is how to preserve UNRWA's neutrality, right? And I explained that UNRWA, this organization that perpetuates this Palestinian refugeehood, could never be neutral because it's a Palestinian organization devoted to the non-existence of the state of Israel. So as I'm speaking, she and her assistant are like making faces. They're not happy. So at one point I'm like, okay, I tell them, look, I see you don't want to listen to me. Listen to Palestinians. They're telling you. So I'm showing her quotes, posters of what Palestinians are saying. UNRWA's services are our right until return, all that. And she looks at me and she says, they don't get to decide. And I remember I was stunned into silence. And then I was like, they kind of do. But again, it's this notion of like, we will speak over them. They might say that they don't want a Jewish state. We'll explain that that's not what they mean. And again, a lot of my work is just listen to them. I recently did a short video. I'm now doing this stuff with Elon's Civilian Spokesperson Initiative. I'm doing these short videos. So one short video I did was about the fact that Palestinians don't lie on this issue. They lie about everything else, you know, genocide, famine, open-air prison. When one lie is exposed, you know, Gaza was an open-air prison, and once that Israel came in, it's become a paradise lost. So they will lie about all these things. The one thing they never lie about is that their identity, their ideology is wrapped up in the negation of Jewish sovereignty. They wrap it up in words like justice and rights and two states, but if you ask the correct question, they will never lie. So I always tell the story of, I gave a talk to a student a few years ago, and one of the students, it was a delegation that came to Israel, one of the students was the head of the Students for Justice in Palestine in her university. So when I finished talking, she said, you just said that Palestinians don't want peace. Which is not what I said. I said that Palestinians never had a vision of peace where there's a Jewish state anywhere to be found. But she said that I said that Palestinians don't want peace, and she said that's not true. I want peace. Now, at this point, 99.99% of people will be like, Einat is wrong. I found a Palestinian, she's even the head of Students for Justice in Palestine, and she wants peace. But I know better by now, so I asked her, what does peace look like? And what was amazing was that no matter how much I challenged her, she couldn't describe a vision of peace where there was a Jewish state anywhere. And whenever I asked her and grilled her, she was like, but Zionism is racism, but how you treat Mizrahi Jews. It was like, she kept throwing all these things, but she just could not utter a vision of peace where there's a Jewish state anywhere. So on this issue, if you ask the correct questions, they don't lie.
So it's such an, in some ways, like it's a terrible place to be, right? Because on one hand, we have the world sort of shouting out for a ceasefire or a two-state solution. And then on the other hand, what I think we keep seeing again and again is that the Palestinians have walked away when offered, you know, a part of the land. And so what you're suggesting, which is that peace or that vision, if one was to have it, actually there is no space for a Jewish people or a Jewish homeland. But what do you do with that as the world is sort of screaming out for a two-state solution? And it seems like the Jewish people repeatedly have said, okay, but that narrative isn't the one that's filling the world. So how do you respond? What do we do? What's our strategy?
So, first of all, you're absolutely right. The Jews have always agreed to a two-state solution going back to the creation of Transjordan, as long as one of the two is Jewish. And the Arabs have always rejected a two-state solution if one of the two is Jewish. That's where we stuck. You know, again, apropos me developing a musical ear for Palestinian language, in the 90s, when Palestinians said two states, and some of them still do, we made the crazy assumption that one of the two is the Jewish state. In retrospect, we had to check. Because when they said two states, they also said, more quietly, the right of return, which again is neither a right nor a return, but in their mind, there is a right for millions of Palestinians to settle inside Israeli sovereign territory, thereby turning the Jews into a minority. So when they said two states plus the right of return, they actually meant an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Arab state to replace Israel through this idea of refugee return, hence from the river to the sea. So they've been very consistent, and by the way, we've been very consistent in always saying yes to two states as long as one is Jewish. And by the way, the reason we say yes is not because we're nice. The reason we say yes is because we're small. We're a small, ethnic, linguistic, religious, national minority in an overwhelming Arab and Muslim Middle East that unfortunately still the majority wants us gone or dead. So we say yes, as long as they will let us be. We'll have a smaller state, but just let us be.
And I loved what you'd said in one of your interviews, which was like, they have all of these great chants and slogans, and then you suggested that ours should be, leave us alone.
Yeah, so that was not my idea. What happened, I was in LA a few months after October 7th. And at the end of my talk, a lot of entertainment industry people were there. Someone comes up to me and says, look, their chants are great. You know, there is only one solution, intifada, revolution, free, free Palestine, very catchy, right? He's like, we got nothing. We just sit there in those vigils, Am Yisrael Chai. He's like, we got nothing. So he says, I've got it. He's like, leave us alone. And I was like, I listened to it, and I was like, you know, you've got something there. Because it is very much, you know, in exact opposition to everything. Colonialism, imperialism, Israel just wants, like, to gobble up. And, like, the overwhelming Israeli, and I would say Jewish, sentiment is just leave us alone. You know, we'll have a smaller state, bigger state. That is secondary to just let us be. And that's everything we're doing, the military, everything is ultimately for the goal of just letting us be. But you're right, everything gets inverted. A lot of my criticism within Israel, let's say two prime ministers, Barak and Olmert, they had, I would say, one job to do once they retired. Their job was to go around the world and say, we offered the Palestinians a state, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, and they walked away and followed it up with violence. That should have been their job. But they're so obsessed with Netanyahu that they go around the world and saying other things. And as a result, this has been just erased from memory. And apropos, cause and effect. The Palestinians tell a story of continuous Israeli perfidy erasing, again, any of their actions, and the fact that every time that they could have had their own state, they have chosen to forgo it because they didn't want their own state if the Jews also have their state. And just one more thing, I would have wanted to see an Israeli prime minister who wakes up every morning and says the following. Good morning. I want to remind everyone that the day that Palestinians end their century-long war against Zionism, the day that they develop as a people a constructive vision of wanting to live in an Arab state next to a Jewish state rather than the destructive vision of from the river to the sea, the day that they recognize that it means that they're not perpetual refugees and they possess no such thing as a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel, we will be happy to live with them in peace, side by side, and not a minute before. Thank you very much. That's what I want, because I think it's critical to always hold. We take things so obviously that we don't say it anymore. But we need to constantly say it. We need to call them out. We need to say it. We need to constantly remind people that we're not the problem here. We will always say yes as long as it's real peace. So turn your attention to where it really needs to go to get the Palestinians to finally develop a constructive vision rather than the destructive one that they had for the last century.
So I want to stay in that place with you. Israel's sort of bracing itself for, please God, what won't be an attack, but is preparing for that worst case scenario of an attack. Flights have stopped, many flights outside of El Al have sort of stopped flying in and out. The protests have started again. The hostages are still in Gaza. A new election may or may not be coming down the pipeline. If you were going to sort of give a overview of sorts in like, where are we right now in this moment of time, and what do you think comes next? And I know none of us know what comes next, and there is no crystal ball. But are there any pieces of the story that you feel obvious to you, or at least, there's a sense? I know in Israel right now, people want our hostages home. I know there's also sort of a sense from some that the assassinations may have, set us a little bit further back in terms of bringing hostages back. Where are we at in Israel?
So as part of my carefully listening to Palestinians, I don't know that there is actually a hostage deal. What really rips my heart is to see Israelis ripping themselves apart over something that I'm not even sure exists. One of the top negotiators, American negotiators for the peace process over the last 3 decades, said recently in a closed briefing, he said, looking back on 3 decades of negotiations and peace process, I have to admit that there were never negotiations. What happened was that Israel offered, and Arafat said no. And Israel offered more, and Arafat said no. And Israel offered more, and Abu Mazen said no. He said, but there were never negotiations in the sense that the Palestinians were trying to achieve something. And I'm adding that to the extent that there were negotiations, it was between America and Israel. America was pressuring Israel. Israel was offering more. And I think a lot of this dynamic is happening again now. We convinced ourselves that we were this close in the 90s or in 2008 with Olmert to a peace agreement with the Palestinians. You still have Israeli negotiators because in the negotiating room there's camaraderie, and I always have to tell them, you were nowhere close. You thought you were close because you were offering all those things, but they were never in the point where they were going to give up their vision of return. Abu Mazen says so to Condoleezza Rice when he walks away. I can't tell 4 million refugees, they're not refugees, but they think they are. I can't tell 4 million refugees that they're not returning. He knew that he had no people with whom to sign an agreement. We were not close. So again, I'm listening to the American administration saying we're close. And I'm hearing echoes of that, and I'm listening to what the Palestinians are saying, and I'm not hearing a deal. I'm hearing certainly not a deal that releases all the hostages. An interim one where we get some bodies and a few people, and essentially everything reverts to October 6th, that might be. But a deal where all hostages, alive and dead, are in Israeli hands? I'm not hearing that such a deal exists. And I fear that we're ripping ourselves apart over this take the deal. The reason, by the way, that the earlier deal existed and happened is, I don't know if you realized, is that it was highly inconvenient for them to have children and women. I don't know if you realize, but in the beginning, there were even Arab and Muslim leaders who began to say, this is not Islam. We do not take women and children. Now, they feel more comfortable. It's men, and the women are soldiers. So they're saying. So the earlier deal happened because they wanted it. Now I'm not hearing that there is a deal where all the hostages are given. Something where some of them are given for a complete going back to October 6th, yes. But when people say take the deal, I think they're imagining something that doesn't actually exist. And it's a tough thing. I don't say it in many places, but really I've made it in many ways my life's work to never again engage in wishful thinking and to listen to what they're saying, and I'm not hearing that. In terms of where we're heading, I started by what I said, like, at the end, the Mullah and Ayatollah regime is gone. The question is how much damage happens in the interim. I think a lot of what Israel needs to do now is a combination of, I mean, even if the Iranian attack doesn't happen now, their goal remains the same, right? Death to Israel, death to America. And these are not just words. It's from their perspective a rational goal. You know, the Shiites are not very favored among the Muslims. Many Muslims don't even consider them Muslims. Imagine the achievement if the Shiite regime is the one that brings an end to the Jewish state. It's a theological coup. So that's their goal. And again, they're saying it again and again and again. So even if the attack doesn't happen now, it's only because they want to do it when they think they have a greater chance of success. The same for Lebanon and Hezbollah. Our job is to make sure that they don't get to attack us when they think they have the greatest chance of success. I'm not sure I like this Israel that's just sitting and waiting. That's not who we used to be. But in addition to that, I think we really need to prepare ourselves for an extended and difficult situation. Someone recently wrote very wisely that all these years of, you know, we were doing so well and it was so quiet and everything was flourishing, we were actually creating debt. We were not really rich. We thought we were rich, but we were accumulating debt. And now we're paying that debt because it wasn't really quiet. Our enemies were building themselves, and we didn't take preventive action because we liked accumulating the debt. We didn't want to pay it. And I don't think we can afford to, again, accumulate more debt. So we need to prepare for something that I think is going to be extended. Sometimes in my more lighthearted days, I call it from startup nation to prepper nation. Prepper nation. We need to prepare. So that's where I think we are. I think we need to hold a clear, positive vision of peace. Also, I talked about the Palestinians, also for Iran. I'm very bullish on Iran once the Ayatollah and Mullah regime goes. They're great people. They're going to be our best friends. We just need to get there. But we need to have a radical positive vision for peace, for what I call Arab and Islamic Zionism. But right now, we need to prepare.
So where do you, say we spend the right now preparing, where do you see opportunities in the future, and where do you experience even just a small bit of hope?
So the biggest hope I have, and for quite some time, is really this thing that I've called Arab Zionism or Islamic Zionism, which is the Arab and Muslim embrace of a sovereign Jewish state as part of an Arab and Muslim identity. And you're beginning to see some elements of that in some Gulf states. There's this internet, the influencer, his name is Luwai al-Sharif, he's from the UAE, he lived in Saudi. He just spoke to the students at the Israel Coalition on campus. We were both also speaking to their educators a few months ago. And I love this. So I was there listening to him because I was going to speak after him. And he's sitting there with his full, Arab garb. And he's telling these Jewish educators who are active on campus, he says, I get the persecution, he says, but that's not your story. You need to tell the story of your connection to the land of Israel. He's like, you built the state of Israel where you built it because of the historical connection of the Jewish people with the land of Israel. That's your story. That's why I can accept you here. And I love that you had an Arab from the UAE explaining to Jewish educators that the story that they have to tell is the one of the historical connection of the Jews with the land, rather than sometimes the story of just persecution and Israel as a refuge, rather than Israel as the realization of a millennia-long hope and dream to really reinstate ourselves in our ancestral homeland. So there's a phrase that says that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So maybe 100 years ago, a few families had phones, and so this is my look. There's not a lot of Luwais, but they do exist. And one of my rays of hope for the last few months is that for the first time ever, in an Israeli situation of crisis, some of the strongest and most articulate voices for Israel have been Arabs, Muslims, ex-Muslims, who have been speaking up and saying, this is not about what Israel has done. This is about our obsession with the non-existence of Israel. We need to let go of that. Enough is enough. Because they know the real story, they've never fought for West-Planning. They are able to say it. And again, I'm under no illusion the majority of the Arab and Muslim Middle East is still very much against us. But for the first time ever, we have those who are looking at Israel, and rather than saying colonial, European settler, interloper, theft, they're saying Abraham. As Arabs and Muslims, we recognize that you belong here, we embrace you here, and I call myself these days a long-term peace activist. I realize there's no quick fixes. It's not about getting out of the West Bank, getting out of Gaza, removing the settlements. No quick fixes. It has to be about a transformation of the Arab, Palestinian, even Muslim identity. So I use what they say in Pirkei Avot, right? You will not finish the job, but it doesn't give you the license to not do it. So I work for this long-term vision of peace, however long it takes.
you, Ben. Okay, we're going to do some fun questions, and then we're going to go to the community's questions. Fun questions. If you were going to, whenever the Prime Minister's term comes to an end, if you were going to pick the next Prime Minister for Israel, anyone, who would you pick?
I would want it to be someone who's actually not there yet. You know, when people ask me about my hope for leadership, right? Because not our great moment. I go to a meme. There's this meme on the internet. Strong leaders create good times create soft leaders. Soft leaders create terrible times create good leaders. So I think that's what we've had. We've had good times that created soft, mediocre, and I'm being generous, leaders. And they've created terrible times. And I think from that moment will emerge the good leaders that we need.
I've heard and I've read before, as a side note, people that are suggesting that this young generation in Israel, our 19 and 20-year-olds, are going to be a part of the greatest generation. So it gives me hope to think that one day they'll be leaders. Okay, your next question. If you were only going to vote on Israel and you were an American, I'm just asking.
Okay, I'll say why it's tough. Because the short answer is this. If I were guaranteed the Trump of 2016, that's what I would take. Only in Israel. Because one of the problems I had between 2016 and 2020 is that when I would meet with delegations coming from the US to Israel, I would tell them, look, putting aside everything that's happening in your country, let's leave it aside for now, in the Middle East, the Trump administration policy is perfect. He has not made a single mistake. He did everything right, breaking with long orthodoxies, and at the end of it, he reaped what he sowed in the form of 4 peace agreements. When the Biden administration came in some, I think, juvenile notion, they just undid what Trump did. It was like, this is something that worked. Why undo that? For about a year, they refused to call the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, they froze Saudi, trying to make it a pariah state, only to realize that when they wanted to make Russia a pariah state, there's only so many oil-rich, gas-rich countries you can make pariahs, so they went back to Saudi with hat in hand. Everything they did, they refunded UNRWA, they re-emboldened the Palestinians with no consequences, no strings attached. Iran, everything they did was wrong, and they're reaping what they're sowing. We're on the verge of a regional war, if not worse. The problem is that Trump is now a wild card. So I don't know if we're going to get the same policy. I'm pretty sure, I don't know anything about Walt, so I don't know about that, but to the extent that Harris has a policy, if it's not different than Biden, then it's been terrible for the Middle East, and we've been paying for that. So it's tough because I don't know if we can get the Trump administration of 2016. Some people are telling me that Jared was key to that, and he's not coming back. So the bottom line is, I don't know. Tough, really. Sorry.
As you were saying that, I was going to look to Ben or Jeremy and be like, can I ask that question? But I think it's too late. Okay. A book you think everybody should read about Israel. A book about Israel. Everyone should read. Yours. Which one?
Except The War of Return? No. I will say that The War of Return, the #1 comment I get about it is that people do tell me that if you're going to read one book about the conflict, it's this. But generally, if you're recommending to people who know nothing about the Jewish people, I highly recommend A History of the Jews by Paul Johnson. It's great. That's my recommendation.
Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to community questions. What are the most effective ways to support Israel currently? Question number 1.
So I don't know if I mentioned it already, but one of the big messages I've been bringing in recent months is because this is a great moment of peril for Israel, for the Jewish people, my message right now is that this is the moment to take care of our own, which especially when I'm in America is, I know, a terrible message. Jews don't like it. Jews want to take care of everyone else, right? Tikkun olam. We want to be allies. Our allies will betray us. We still want to be their allies. And my message is, what do they teach you in all those self-care seminars? You want to care for everyone else, but first yourself? Right now, this is the time to take care of our own. All the resources, all the time, the passion, the efforts right now is for caring for the Jewish people, whether it's on campuses. So whether it's on campuses, whether in Israel, this is really the time to stand with our people, and to the extent that we do have willing allies, let them know that what we need from them ultimately is to stand up for their country. I think there are 5 arenas now: the Middle East, France, Britain, Canada, America. In all of them, Jews are endangered in some way or another, and it will only end. We're too small to end it ourselves. That has never been something we could do ourselves. But what we need from allies is people who will stand and say, this is not America, not here. This is not Canada, this is not France. And until they rise up and say, this is not America, we are not the country that does Israel's genocide and keep the world clean. Until they stand up for that, we need to ensure that we pass through this moment, period, with as least damage as possible, which is why we need to take care of our own.
So, Dr. Wilf, it's a custom that we have in our sanctuaries to invite people to offer a prayer or a blessing. I know, I gotcha. And I would love for you to offer a prayer or a blessing to us as a part of the Jewish people and for the greater Jewish people as our closing bracha. I'm going to give you a minute to think if you need it.
Well, there was, sorry. Do you know what chazak and ematz means? That's it, basically. That's all we have. Be strong, be courageous.
So I want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you especially to Dr. Einat Wilf for being with us.
Can I say just something?
Yeah.
I just want to tell you, I visit many communities, many synagogues. What you have here, I'm sure you know, is extraordinary. Both the place and the community, so thank you. Really.
And I would be remiss not to share that if you go outside the door into the Offit Auditorium, you will find refreshments and the opportunity, most importantly, to process and discuss so many of the things that were brought up tonight. Thank you, Dr. Wilf, and be strong and courageous.